reasons why we get together and why we spend time together in fellowship and discussion. But I think one of the most important reasons is because, first and foremost, we wouldn't be here if we didn't feel a call towards God. And more importantly, not only do we feel called towards God, but we realize that the best way to pursue this is by coming together for encouragement and for fellowship and for all the things that we get from this community. And one of the things that I think that we really need to remind ourselves of, because everything in life takes its toll on us, is and if you listen to the words this morning and even the readings this morning, there's this theme of having a passion for God, having a passion for the things of God. I loved what Paul was talking this morning to the church in Thessalonica, in Thessalonians. He was saying, what did he say? He said, the word came to you not just in word only. So the testimony came to you not just in word only, but with power. And what happens, they saw this, and he said, and you saw that we were no ordinary guys doing this, that this was something bigger than us. And he said, you became imitators of that. And there was a passion that came with it. And I guess this morning I was thinking, as we become overwhelmed in life, and as we become accustomed to maybe the everyday status quo type of things, it's easy to let our faith follow in that same vein. And we really need to come together every single week and encourage each other. And let God encourage us to fuel that passion, fan those flames. Because when we leave here, we go out there, and whether it's work or school, or we will encounter a variety of people and a variety of attitudes, and most of them are not there with the intention of encouraging us and uplifting us. So that's why here has got to be the place where we are loving and caring and encouraging and help build each other up and never tear each other down. We get enough tearing down outside. And here, this is a place. So this is one of the reasons why we come together, to help have a passionate life for God. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning, about what do we do in our life and how can we be passionate for the things that God has called us to do. Because we're going to be passionate about something in life. Each and every one of us is. I mean, if you turn on Sunday afternoon football games, you'll see, 85,000 people that are passionate for a team, or passionate for a concert, or passionate for something. We will be excited about something in life. What do we spend that excitement on? What do we spend that passion on? What do we devote our attention to? Is it possible to make God something worthwhile to be passionate about? Because we do live in a very uncertain world. The kind of news that dominates the headlines today. If we turn on the television or open the newspaper, what kind of news do we see going on? Struggles for life. Fear lurking behind every corner. It's true. Homes that have been ravaged by natural disasters. Lives shaken and broken by madmen, hell-bent on destruction and death. These are things that are commonplace for us, for our kids to experience. Some days it takes all that we have just to turn on the news for fear of what disaster we'll be faced with today. Mass shootings, hurricanes, wildfire outbreaks. Times are indeed strange. I was thinking this morning, as I was putting these thoughts together, and I said, what kind of things were we, even just a few years ago, what were we dealing with? Anybody remember how just a couple short years ago, how the Ebola virus was such a widespread panic? Everyone was afraid it was going to erupt into a global pandemic. Interesting how fear will never be in short supply. Now, who thinks about Ebola today? I haven't thought about it in several years. Now it's wildfires in California, or people without power, or hurricanes, or mass shootings. And the truth is, it doesn't matter what form fear takes, it will always be plenty of it. The stories may change. The locations will vary. But in the end result will always be the same. Times are indeed strange. But there is something that we know for sure. In fact, the only thing that we know for sure, and something that we need to reiterate, each and every day is that God is faithful. In times like this, it is during times like this, as well as just everyday struggles and fears, that we have to remember the wonderful verses in Scripture that God has promised us. Psalm 23:4 says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they will comfort me. Psalm 27, verse 1, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Psalm 118, verse 6, the Lord is with me. I will not be afraid. Amen. For what can man do to me? 2 Timothy 1:7, for God did not give us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power, of love, and self-discipline. Aren't those wonderful verses? Aren't those things that we need to read, to meditate, to ponder on, to write on our refrigerators or our bathroom mirrors? Things that we need to remind ourselves. Because, see, we will become passionate about something. We'll become passionate in our fear. We'll do everything we can to protect our kids or protect our homes. We'll put up smoke detectors and burglary alarms, and we'll do everything we can out of fear. Now, those are not bad things to do, but we can dwell on the bad and on the negative and do everything we can to protect walls and build walls around us. And the problem is those walls don't just stop with the concrete blocks of our house. Those walls we begin to protect ourselves start becoming walls around our hearts, around our lives, that don't let anybody in. We can be entrapped by fear, but we are called to trust in God, to sell out to Him and live for Him. And then we can go about our lives. And when bad stuff happens, and unfortunately it will happen, as we know, we'll have faith that will promise us that we can work through any and every challenge or struggle. And I think this is the environment that Jesus kind of found himself in that morning when he encountered the Pharisees, or just every day when he walked on earth as a man. It was a tough economic and political climate. His followers were constantly under attack and persecution from an evil Roman Empire. And to even make matters worse, the people who should have been on his side, all the religious people, and there were a lot of religious people at that time, they didn't care for him or his people either. There was a story about a burglar, a guy who needed money to pay his income taxes. So he decided to rob the safe in a store. When he broke in, he found the safe, and he was very pleased to find a note that said, please don't use dynamite. The safe is not locked. Just turn the knob and open the door. So that's exactly what he did. As soon as he turned the knob, pulled the door open, a heavy sandbag fell on him. The entire premises were floodlighted and alarms started clanging. And as the police carried him out on a stretcher, he was heard moaning, my confidence in human nature has been rudely shaken. How many of us have ever felt as if a giant sandbag has fallen on our heads? When life doesn't go as expected, it can be staggering. Maybe you've planned for something to go a certain way, and then the unexpected happens. Fill in the blank, whatever that is. We all know the story. I want to take a step back this morning and put ourselves in the shoes of the Pharisees for a brief minute. A couple of verses before today's reading, we see Jesus talking in parables. He's telling a story about a landowner that's decided to plant a vineyard, and he hires guys to work in it. But these guys decide that they will keep the land and the profits for themselves. We remember this story. So the owner, what does he do? He sends a few messengers to see what's going on, and they mistreat the messengers. So he sends a few more, and they beat them up. And it happens a couple of times, so then the landowner decides, you know what, I'm going to send my very own son. Surely they'll listen to him. Well, as we know, as Jesus tells us, the landowners get very crafty and say, wow, here's the best opportunity to get back at him. We'll kill his son. And they do that. The ultimate insult. They kill the landowner's son. And today, we know what Jesus was talking about, right? This is a pretty common theme. Okay, hey, we sent all these prophets ahead of time to warn you, and they beat him up, they mistreat him, so God says, I'm going to send my own son. So what do they decide to do? We're going to kill God's only son. We know Jesus was talking about himself. Matthew 21 says something interesting, though. Verse 45. Not only do we know who Jesus was talking about, but we start to see the people of that time knew that Jesus was talking about as well. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parable, well, they knew that he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held him as a prophet. These guys were mad. They were ticked off. Who is this guy that can come and challenge the status quo? Challenge what it is that we believe is right and what we live for. And can you blame them? I mean, the truth is, they thought they were right. And they thought they were safe. But they had lost sight of what was really important. So what were they going to do about it? Well, Matthew tells us, continuing on, he says that the Pharisees, verse 15, the Pharisees went and plotted together how they might trap him in what he said. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are a truthful and teach the way of God in truth, and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not? So the Pharisees had gotten so angry, Jesus was talking about them, they understood Jesus was talking about them, and they got upset, and their anger had blinded them. So they start to think of a way that they can get back at him. Now, if we think about it for a moment, about some of the ironies here. We know, because we live on this side of the resurrection, that Jesus was God. They, if you think about it in terms of him, what did they think of him? They thought he was demonic, an agent of Satan. We know that Jesus is the King of Kings today. Well, they thought he just wanted to be the King of Israel. We know that he was the Son of God today, but in their time, what did they think of him? It's just Mary and Joseph's kid. We know that Jesus has influenced the world for over 2,000 years. They thought his influence would end at the cross. It's a fascinating story. Today we look at the Pharisees and we shake our heads. How could they have been so wrong? How could they have not known that the truth was standing there right in front of them? I believe that they were upset because Jesus held them accountable for their hypocrisy. Teacher, we know that you are sincere, they said to him, and teach the way of God. Now, don't think for a minute that they actually believed that. Did they believe he was sincere? Did they believe he taught the way of God? See, it was all set up. It was a way of putting him at ease before they stabbed him in the back. Tell us then, they continue, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor? Paying taxes. Who likes to pay taxes? I don't see a single hand going up. This is the perfect trap. Genevieve likes to pay taxes. I appreciate that, Genevieve. This was basically a damned if you do or damned if you don't type of question. Because, see, it doesn't matter how Jesus answered. He was liable by his answer to offend somebody. He would be faulted by someone. Think about it. When it comes to paying taxes today, we hate them. We hate them. 7% of sales tax it's frustrating because, the ticket reads this, but it's really not that price. And then you have to remind, especially if you're sending kids out, here's $20 for dinner. You can't buy something on the menu that's $20 because when you get your bill, it's going to be $21.35 or whatever the difference is. You don't think of this kind of stuff, and 7% on everything is frustrating, but not nearly as frustrating as April 15th when the big tax bill comes due. No one likes paying taxes. It was like the story that happened one late night in Washington, D.C., where a mugger was wearing a ski mask and he jumped into the path of a well-dressed man, stuck a gun in his ribs and said, "Give me your money." Indignant, the affluent man says, "You can't do this to me. I'm a U.S. congressman." "Oh, well, in that case," replied the robber, "give me back my money." Or there was a road sign in Oklahoma that someone placed demanding that we pay no taxes. Ironically, the road sign was placed along a federally funded interstate highway. There is no free lunch in this life. We all know that. But still some people want the privileges of citizenship without its responsibility. And at least the pain is universal. According to an item in the Associated Press a while back, tax authorities in a city in southern India found a new way to handle tax evaders. What they would do is they would send teams of drummers to stand outside their homes or the shops of those who refused to pay taxes and pound noisily on the drums until the obligations were met. Tax officials in that city had been successful, they said, in recovering nearly $1 million owed by these tax cheats by this method. The sense of shame evoked by the racket is enough to make most people come out and pay, says a tax official who noted the drive has been such a great success that we've had several inquiries from other cities and towns about the practice. I hope our tax officials do not find out about its success, as our neighborhoods tend to be noisy enough. The people of Jesus' time felt exactly the same way about paying taxes that most of us do, especially come middle of April. But you see, paying taxes for those guys was even more of a problem. For one thing, they had to use Roman currency to pay their taxes. And Roman coins had what on it? As we know what Jesus said, an image of Caesar. A devout Israelite would never own or carry a Roman coin because it was considered a violation of the commandment against graven images. So to have a coin would break one of their commandments because what does the commandment say? You shall have no graven images. And they viewed this as a very serious law. The currency was one problem in itself. But even more of a problem was the injustice of the tax system. See, as unjust as we might feel our tax system is, it was nothing compared to the free-range tax situation of that time. William Barclay said this: a tax was payable for using the main roads, the harbors and the markets. So you'd have to pay a tax to use the roads. A tax was payable on a cart, on each wheel of the cart, on the animal which drew it. A tax collector could bid a man to stop on the road, unpack his bundles, and charge him whatever he liked. If a man could not pay, sometimes the tax collector would offer to lend him money at an exorbitant rate of interest, and so then get him further into his clutches. Now we might complain about the IRS, but in truth, they're sweethearts compared to the tax collectors of Jesus' time. Why were they so hated? Why was Zacchaeus so hated? Why was Matthew so hated? These guys that were tax collectors, they were considered sellouts to their own people, robbing from already poor people. The fact is that taxes are a fact of life then just as now. And all of this is a beautiful backdrop for our lesson today. So the Pharisees decided to lay a trap for Jesus. They sent their disciples to him along with some Herodians. And what do they say to him? As we know, teacher, we know that you're a man of integrity and you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, in your opinion, is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Now I mentioned this was dangerous ground for Jesus. Why? If he said not to pay taxes, he would be in big trouble with the Romans. Tax was law. So if you said, don't pay taxes, those guys are crooks. Well, then they could go, see this guy here, he's coming against your laws. They wanted to go right to Rome and complain about Jesus and have him taken out. He'd be in big trouble with them. But at the same time, if he said pay your taxes, he would offend his own people. It was really a winless situation. Of course, Jesus knew what they were trying to do. He called them hypocrites. He said, why are you trying to trap me? Show me a coin that you use to pay taxes. And they brought him a denarius. And he asked them, whose image is this? And whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. And he had one of his most famous sayings, then give back to Caesar what is already his, and give to God what is God's. Now I suppose we ought to be grateful to these Pharisees this day. In their question, which Jesus says was motivated by malice, They prompt one of Jesus' greatest teachings. Now, it may not seem like much on the face, but its implications have echoed through the centuries and in fact shaped Western society. Jesus said, "Render to Caesar the things that are his, and to God the things that are God's." And I guess this morning we should ask a couple of questions. Find out why this has such a great influence. I think the first question is, what then is Caesar's? Well, we'll look at that just in a second, but first, let's look back, take a step back to the actual question that is being asked. For the Pharisees are not asking Jesus a secular question. What do you think about paying taxes? They're asking a religious question. Look at how they phrase the question. Is it permitted, they said. The question could be paraphrased. Is it in accordance with the law, the Torah, to pay taxes to Caesar? They're asking Jesus if the Mosaic law would support taxes paid to a pagan ruler. Now this is a lot deeper than just, hey, what do you think? We're told that the Pharisees first went out of the temple to lay plans to trap Jesus with their words. Now that in itself is interesting. They had to go out of the temple to conspire because they didn't want to do that in such a holy place. The fact that they knew what they were doing was wrong, and they're like, we don't dare defile the temple with our scheming, so we'll go out to lay these plans. There is no absence of malice. They have deliberately fashioned this tricky question. When they return, Jesus is presented with a dilemma. If he says, don't pay the tax, they'll be able to accuse him before Pilate of anti-Roman activity. But if he says, pay the tax, he'll lose favor with the people for whom the Roman tax was evil and a symbol of their lost freedom. So what does he do? Jesus is brilliant. Incredibly brilliant. He asks for a coin. Now, if you were to hold a Roman denarius in your hand, you would quickly understand the use that Jesus makes of it. Here's a likeness of what it would perhaps be. The head displays the reigning emperor, and the tail and inscription reading in the time of Jesus, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus Pontifex Maximus. The emperor was the high priest of Rome's pagan religion. And there's a bit of humor here. Standing on the holiest ground in all of Israel, within the temple's walls, the Pharisees are able to quickly produce a coin that, by their own law, says that they shouldn't even have in their presence and on their possession. Breaking a commandment, but they're like, Jesus, let me have a coin. And here they're like, here's one right here. The second of the 10 Commandments expressly warns against the use of idols. Their hypocrisy is quickly exposed. But Jesus doesn't dwell on that. And we're like, oh, can I see a Roman coin? I'm sure none of you have one, right? He doesn't even dwell on it. He just lets that one go. He takes the coin and he says, whose face is on it? Take a look at it. Caesar's. Well, it's already his if his picture's on it. So just give it back to him. But give to God the things that are God's. George Weigel, the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., has called this a revolutionary text whose public implications have been working themselves out for almost 2 millennia. As a Christian, who is a citizen of the United States, and what does it mean to give Caesar his due? Let me answer this the most obvious way I know. Give to the Caesar what is his, and give to God's what is his. It's an idea which has been worked out over the centuries. Paul talks about, in Romans, recognizes the role of government. And he said that the government is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment upon the wrongdoer. Now, God's servant, what is government? Government is that which is there to protect us, which is there to carry out judgment. Now, judgment's always kind of a squeamish topic for Christians. We don't like that. We're not supposed to judge. But the truth is, when we pay our taxes, we are supporting a government whose judicial system is there to judge. There's no way around it. There is a role for the punishment of crime, and a Christian's duty is to support that system. It's an apostolic teaching in Christianity to pay our taxes. Another duty, and more importantly, is to pray for our leaders. And I suggest that every November during an election year, it's our duty to vote. We've talked about this come November. And we've all learned the value of our vote. As you look through history, how much does really one vote count? In fact, one vote caused Charles I to be executed in 1649. One vote kept Aaron Burr from becoming president in 1800. One vote made Texas the part of the United States in 1845. One vote saved Andrew Johnson from impeachment, 1868. One vote admitted California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho into the Union in the mid-1800s. One vote made Adolf Hitler head of the Nazi Party, 1923. One vote per precinct would have elected Richard Nixon rather than John Kennedy president in 1960. I'm only one, but I am one, and so are you. We can't do everything, but we can each do something, and that's what we ought to do, and that's by the grace of God we will do. That should be the attitude of every Christian and citizen in matters here on earth, that we have been granted a wonderful opportunity to live in this country. We should do everything we can to support it. What is Caesar's? That was the first question raised by Jesus. Well, we know what Caesar's is. What is the United States? What is where we live? The things of this. We can point that out pretty easily. Take a look at any piece of money in our wallet right now, and it's the heads of state, it's presidents, it's famous people within our country. But the second question, I think, is a little trickier, but certainly a whole lot more important. What is God's? Now I want you to imagine the religious leaders as they go out of the temple to scheme. Then they return with this trick question. They wait knowingly that they have placed Jesus in an impossible position. Jesus then asks for a coin, asks his images on it. They say Caesar's. And then comes the moment. Now don't you wish that in your life you had opportunities like this where the perfect comeback has come to you? Maybe a question that one of your kids have posed, or something at work, your boss or something, and have just the perfect retort. Moment of clarity like Jesus had. Similar to the window cleaner who was working on a scaffold outside the 20th floor of a skyscraper. And he was surprised to see a secretary pressing a large sheet of paper against the window, and on big letters she had written, "It's 72 degrees in here." Undaunted, the half-frozen window cleaner reached into his own pocket, pulled out a pen and a notebook, and scribbled a message of his own. With a big smile, he held it close to the window and said, "It's $30 an hour out here." Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's. You could think for a month and not come up with any better answer. If Caesar wants his tax, then give it to him. His face is on the coin anyway, so it must be his. But what is God's? What is God's? I want you to know this is not a 50-50 proposition. God is due more than the government. Caesar's role in your life is vastly inferior to God's role in your life. If the coin bears an image of George Washington, then it must be his, so give it back to him. But each of us, we bear the image of God. Amen. You are created in his image, so give it back to him. Luciano Pavarotti says that when he was a boy, his father, a baker, introduced him to the wonders of song. He urged him to work hard to develop his voice. A professional tenor in his hometown of Italy took him as a pupil. Pavarotti also enrolled in a teacher's college. On graduating, he asked his father, "Shall I be a teacher or a singer?" Luciano's father replied, "If you try to sit on two chairs, you will fall between them. For life, you must choose one chair." Pavarotti later in life wrote, "I chose one. It took 7 years of study and frustration before I made my first professional appearance. It took another 7 to reach the Metropolitan Opera." He says, "And now when I think about whether it's laying bricks, writing a book, or whatever we choose to do, we should give ourselves to it. Commitment," he says, "is the key. Choose one chair." In other words, give to God what is God's means to sell out your whole life to God's purposes. We are to be radically committed to loving God and loving others. That's the passion I was talking about. Bill Hybels tells about a woman named Bev. Bev and her husband owned a nearby condo which they rented to their daughter. One night, some kids were throwing mud balls. One of them happened to hit the condo's front window and shattered it. The daughter got the name and phone number of the young man who had thrown the rock. But when she was finally able to reach his mother, as a parent, the family did not have available funds to have the window repaired. The mother promised that she would send money when she could, but with both her and her husband out of work, the likelihood of that happening was slim. So Bev and her husband paid to have the window repaired for themselves. Several months passed. Bev's daughter still had not heard a word from the kid's mom, so Bev decided to call the woman herself. It was a couple days before Thanksgiving, she explained, and I was preparing to do our final grocery shopping. But something prompted me to place the call before I left the house. She reached the boy's mother that day, and instead of pressuring her into making good on the funds for repairing the window, Bev heard herself ask something entirely different. "I was just heading to the grocery store," she said. "May I bring you a Thanksgiving meal?" Shocked by her own compassion, Bev went to the store, purchased 2 of everything that her family would be enjoying on Thanksgiving, and with a genuine sense of joy, dropped off overflowing bags at the woman's house en route back to her home. Can you imagine, Bill Hybels asked, how deeply this unemployed mother must have been marked by a spontaneous gift of generosity from a woman he'd never met and to whom she owed money? Now let me ask you a question. Who do you think had the best Thanksgiving that year? The family who received the free groceries, or Bev and her family? We know the answer. It's a secret that only a few people ever truly discover. It's more blessed to give than to receive. Let me give you one more example. A man came to his pastor and said, "I don't know what's wrong with my life, but my faith doesn't bring me the joy it once did. I still live a moral life, I go to church, but how can I recover that joy?" His pastor said, "This is what you should do. Go to the store and buy a big basket full of groceries and go to an address of the poor family that I will give you. Then when you've given your gift, you sit down with them and find out what they need. Let them know you're interested in them and that you are their friend. Lead them in the Lord's Prayer, and before you leave, your joy will be restored." And that's exactly what the guy did, and it worked. You see, radical generosity is the secret to a blessed life. Of course, radical generosity is part of what it means to follow Jesus. Jesus gave his all. He rendered everything he had and everything that he was to God. And that's why we worship him today. That's why we seek after radical generosity in our own lives. David Dykes tells a delightful story about what happened in the church he once served. He was a pastor in Alabama, and the church was in their stewardship campaign to raise money for a new building. There was a lady named Nell in their church who was a widow. Her husband had left her a lot of money, and she had certainly had a lot more than she needed. Nell loved the Lord and loved her church, but she tended to be rather conservative. So on the night of the stewardship banquet, she received her pledge card. She wrote down an amount that was very safe. It was not a radically generous gift at all, but on that evening, Dykes spoke about the passage in which Jesus talked about don't store up your treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and corrupt, and thieves break in and steal, but lay up your treasures in heaven. He went on to speak about how a moth will eat wool when it's stored, but not when we wear it. And he talked about moths for a great deal. Then he talked to the point about how rust destroys tools when they're being stored, but not when they're being used. His point was that when we store up God's resources, they don't accomplish anything. And we have to use them or they'll become moth-eaten garments or rust-encrusted tools. And the widow that night went home from the banquet feeling a little guilty about the amount she had pledged to give in light of the large amount she was storing up. And as she recounts, she walked up to her front door, opened her purse to get out her key, and was shocked what happened next. That somehow a huge moth had got inside of her purse. And when she opened it, the moth fluttered and flew out. Surprised beyond belief, she decided that God had decided to use and send that moth to her to teach her a lesson. She didn't need to be storing up everything that she had. She needed to be using it for God. So she returned to the church. Now, she lived across the street, so it wasn't a far walk. And she asked for her card back. She doubled her amount, then marked it out and tripled her amount. David Dykes recounts later, he said, "Folks, I had the hardest time getting that moth into her purse." He went on to say, "No, seriously, I have no idea how it got there. But Nell believes it was God that put it there." Don't you just love that story? So many people are miss the joy of giving simply and solely because they're afraid. So they save up for a rainy day that maybe never happens, never comes. It's a shame that we can't trust God to provide for our needs. Then they would discover the joy of radical generosity in their giving to God and to those in need. Are we one of these people? Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Well, there's not much choice there. Render to God's what is God's. That's where the true joy lies. You see, this is a world filled with doom and gloom. But in the midst of that, we can still find joy. It's a wonderful promise of God. Joy is there. We can be passionate for the things of God. We can live a life that is radical for God, despite what the news says, despite what the headlines say, despite what's happening at work and in our own lives. We can find joy. We can have joy. We've been given all the gifts of joy, hope. And these gifts are not just meant for us. See, that's where the problem is. We get a gift and we focus on it. We internalize it. But see, what breeds this is by living a radical life of giving. Meant for others. Extending ourselves. Generosity. Extending peace. Extending joy. We're called to share the joy. Share the hope. Share the love of God to all that we encounter. If we do that, I promise you we can be part of an epidemic outbreak of a completely different kind. Amen. Let's close with prayer this morning. Take our offering. We will be announcing this during announcements, but we wanted to take a special offering this morning, as many of you know.